Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Sheikh Hamza Karamali. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you, Paul, for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here.
And welcome back from Canada and North America, where you've just been on tour, I think. So it's good to see you back in Turkey.
Back home, Istanbul.
Istanbul. For those who don't remember, Hamza teaches parents, teachers and scholars rational arguments for the truth of Islam. You can experience some of those arguments by watching a free video series called The Quranic Case for God, and I'll put links to these videos in the description below. He has a bachelor's and master's degree in computer engineering from the University of Toronto, additional bachelor's and master's degrees in Islamic law and legal theory from Jamia Nizami in Hyderabad. He has studied and memorized traditional manuals in all of the Islamic sciences with distinguished Muslim scholars. On their recommendation, he founded Basira Education, where he produces courses, videos, and writes books and articles on the application of traditional Islamic theology to contemporary faith challenges from modern science and philosophy. On the Basira YouTube channel, he has produced a YouTube series called The Thinking Person's Guide to Atheist Arguments, and more recently, a series about the beautiful person of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, called Discover the Prophet. And I'll link to these in the description below. Now, today, Hamza is going to discuss the fascinating concept of irreducible complexity and how Muslims should see this concept. Now, Michael Behe is the author of a number of very influential books, most famously Darwin's Black Box, in which he formulated his idea of irreducible complexity. Now, Behe, by the way, is professor of biological sciences at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in the US, and he has a very good website called michaelbehe.com, which I recommend you have a look at. So, Hamza, what are your thoughts on that concept and his argument from an Islamic perspective?
So, Behe's 1996 book has been around for almost 30 years now, and it's probably the most influential book in the intelligent design movement since it was written. It's still widely used by Muslims, uncritically, I think. And I think that his argument it's based on a weak materialism. So materialism is something that scientists are normally criticized for, but I think that the intelligent design argument, it also assumes a weak form of materialism, and materialism. I hope that in our conversation today, I'll show that it is. It's not just something that we're religiously opposed to. But it's also something that we are rationally opposed to, because it's a rational argument, a rational Islamic argument for the falsehood of materialism. And when we look at this idea of irreducible complexity through the lens of the traditional Muslim argument from contingency, then it doesn't quite fit. I think there are a number of very important insights that it brings. And but if we put it into a formal Muslim logical presentation, then it clicks in a slightly different way, and that's what I hope to show you today.
Well, that's tantalizing and fascinating. So, can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So I prepared some slides. These I'm going to show the formal version of the intelligent design argument. This is taken from a forthcoming book, inshallah, I hope in a couple of months to release it. It's called Kalam 3.0, Muslim Logical Arguments for the Truth of Islam in the 21st Century. So this is a sneak preview of one of the formal arguments that I will be presenting in that book. So this is a comparison between two arguments. On the left-hand side, there is what I call the Muslim Quranic design argument, which is what I'm going to show you irreducible complexity should look like. It's a more coherent presentation of it. And on the right-hand side, there's the Christian intelligent design argument. And that's what I want to focus on today.
Okay.
Just a second. So Behe doesn't formalize his argument in this way. He's a scientist, a top-notch scientist, and scientists don't normally do formal arguments. They make scientific arguments, inference to the best explanation arguments. But in order for us to understand really what is happening, we need to step back and look at the big picture. And so this is a formalization that I think helps us see the big picture. And I think it's very useful for analyzing his argument.
Right.
So there's two premises. A traditional syllogism, it has two propositions. And these two propositions, which are labeled here as IDN1, IDN2, they formally entail the truth of the conclusion, meaning that if somebody accepts the truth of the first proposition, and if they accept the truth of the second proposition, then they have to accept the truth of the conclusion. And if they don't accept the truth of the conclusion, they're only entitled to do that if they don't accept one of the two propositions that formally entail the conclusion. So putting a formal structure helps us clarify our thoughts, and it also helps us limit the points of attack and analyze things in a really clear way. So the first proposition here is normally not stated, but it's assumed in the intelligent design argument. In this first proposition, it's an either or. We call it a disjunction. It says that that there's biological design. So we're going to look at a famous example of biological design that Michael Behe popularized as part of his argument, the bacterial flagellum. And so this biological design, there are two possibilities. Either it has natural causes or it has a supernatural cause. And this is the crux of the argument. The argument, it sets up a competition between natural causation and supernatural causation. And then it uses design to argue that particular phenomena, they are the results of supernatural agency, intelligent design, rather than random, unguided, no intelligence, natural causes. So this first premise...
If I could just, that seems to reflect perfectly or mirror what an atheist would agree with that. They'll say, well, the universe is either created by a supernatural agent or it's entirely a natural process. So there's agreement between the atheist and the Christian intelligent design on the two options, the first premise or the second premise. Would that be fair?
Actually, I think that many materialists would not accept this. Right. Because many materialists, they don't even consider supernatural agency. So they rule it out. So they say from the outset that intelligent design, supernatural agency is impossible. And that's often not brought to light. So the formalization of the argument is going to help us bring this to light and understand what's going on. So when an intelligent design advocate, he says that the science proves the existence of a supernatural being, and then a common scientific response is that it's not, this isn't real science, or science is committed to methodological naturalism, or something along those lines. Really what they're doing is they don't want to engage with his argument because they have from the outset dismissed the possibility of supernatural causation. Right. So in order to argue that particular examples of complexity in the natural world lead to the conclusion of an intelligent designer, you first have to admit the possibility of there being an intelligent designer. So that's the first kind of setting the stage. Either it's a natural cause, and a natural cause is non-volitional. So I prefer to use the terms volitional agent rather than an intelligent designer. They're synonymous for our purposes.
Volition means a being with a will, a purpose, you mean?
Yeah. So the idea is that design shows knowledge. That's intelligent design, and a particular design has been purposefully chosen by someone who has agency. So design is evidence for agency. And in the natural world, on materialism, there isn't any agency. There's just the initial conditions of the Big Bang, atoms and molecules bumping into each other, and the laws of nature. And there's no choice. There's no volition. There's no knowledge. Things are just the blind result of laws of nature, which are not agents. And that's really the point of contention. So after setting up the argument by putting forward this possibility or this dichotomy, the second premise, so the first says either A or B. The second premise rejects A. It says that the design that we see could not have come about through natural causation. And there are many different kinds of intelligent design arguments that can be made, but all of them, they fall into this general framework. So Behe, he argues, using the concept of irreducible complexity, that the certain kinds of design in living things could not have been a result of natural causation. And why? Because they are irreducibly complex. That means that they cannot be arrived at by a step-by-step evolutionary process. So he's arguing against the theory of evolution. And so this form of the argument, actually, it can be, there's two main kinds of intelligent design arguments. One is it argues from biological design against the theory of evolution. Another one argues from the constants of the universe, and this is called the fine-tuning argument. There's small differences, but for today, I want to focus on the first kind, which is a design argument that seeks to invalidate, to show that a particular phenomenon in living things could not have been arrived at by evolution, natural selection, random mutation. And when he shows that, then his argument is that he's shown that a natural cause could not have produced this phenomenon. Therefore, it has a supernatural cause. Therefore, it has an intelligent designer.
Yeah.
So the thesis of evolution is that living things were very simple, and as they reproduce, there are random mutations, and that introduces variety into the offspring. And then some of these mutations, they result in biological features that are advantageous to the survival of that living thing. And because that living being is now more likely to survive, it's now more likely to pass on its traits to its offspring. And then those traits, they become more popular. And then over a very, very long period of time, through gradual changes, things become adapted to their environments. And so this design that we see in living things everywhere, where there's this amazing adaptation to their environments, it's a result of natural causes, unguided, no design, really. No
design, everyone.
Yeah. No design. And so Behe says his contribution is that there are certain kinds of complexity that don't just show purpose, because he would admit that certain kinds of purpose in living things can be the result of natural evolutionary processes. But he says that there are certain kinds of purpose that are irreducibly complex, meaning that their complexity cannot be reduced into smaller functions.
Yeah.
So in order for a complexity to arrive at a particular stage through natural selection and evolution, random mutation, it needs to have performed a useful function. It was advantageous to the animal, and then it improves. The useful function improves, and then the useful function improves, and then it improves, and then it improves. So he says that there are certain kinds of natural phenomena which are so amazingly complex that you cannot imagine any kind of step-by-step improvement to get there. And his classic example is the bacterial flagellum. So the flagellum is that whip-like structure, the filament that you see here. And bacteria, they use it to move about in their fluid environment. And it's really amazing. And we've only discovered its complexity in the modern age. And Behe says that this kind of complexity, it's something that Darwin could not have been aware of because it's a complexity that appears at the level of molecules, at the level of biochemistry. That's why he calls his book Darwin's Black Box, because Darwin, he saw outward similarities between living things, but he didn't really understand at a deep, deep level what was happening at the molecular level. And Behe says that at the molecular level, when you look at things, they are amazing, and they are amazing. And he focuses in on the bacterial flagellum, which is this whip-like structure. And bacteria, they use it to move about in fluids. And when you examine it, it looks like a machine. So there is a whip-like structure. This is the green thing. There's something called a hook. That's the blue thing that's attaching the whip to the base. And then there's a basal structure. And the thing in the base, it has something that's a motor. There's ions that go into it, and then it rotates at a really, really fast speed. And the bacterium, it can control its movement. So it rotates in one way and it moves forward, and it rotates another way and it moves backward. And there are other kinds of motion that are possible as well. And all of this is made using proteins, like intricately designed molecules. And Behe says there's like 40 proteins, and he says you remove any one of them, it breaks down. So he uses the example of an engine, of a motorboat has an engine. He said, can you, and it's a good example because this is very much like the engine. It has many of the same parts. He says if you just take away one part, it stops working. And so you can't imagine, there could not have been a step-by-step process, evolutionary process, unguided, random process by which this complexity, it arrived at this, amazing level. And when he does that, this concept of irreducible complexity, he uses it to rule out natural causation, which in this case is evolutionary progression to greater and greater, gradual evolutionary progression towards greater and greater complexity. And that allows him to conclude that there is a supernatural designer with an intelligence that speeded up things. So he doesn't actually deny evolution by natural selection. He doesn't deny universal common descent. He believes that humans and chimpanzees do have a common ancestor. But he says that there needed to be the guiding hand of an intelligent designer that speeded up the process at certain places and fixed things.
You seem to be saying on the one hand is irreducibly complex, which and therefore can't be the product of unguided evolution. On the other hand, he's saying, well, it is the process of evolution. It's just speeded up by God. I don't understand this.
So there's an evolutionary process, and then there's a jump that's required. And that jump, evolution can't do it. And so the hand of an intelligent designer does something, and then it continues.
But is he suggesting at that point that this jump I don't know if he has the Cambrian explosion, this idea of punctuated equilibrium in mind. Is that what he's referring to? This idea of the sudden appearance of a whole raft of species from apparently nowhere in geological time. But is he saying God literally did a miracle there? Is that he's saying? Is it like a supernatural event where a previously relatively mundane process is transformed miraculously into this apparently irreducibly complex phenomena? Is that his story? Is he mixing different explanations, then, supernatural and natural, to account for everything he sees?
Yeah, that's how I would say it. But he very carefully avoids reference to God, and he just uses intelligent design, because opposition to evolution has a checkered history in the United States, and he was a witness in one of the trials, and he was cross-examined, and so he advocated for on the side of the quote unquote anti-scientific establishment. So he doesn't say God. He just says there is an intelligent designer.
So it could be an alien species that created this, in principle.
In principle, yeah.
So it's not supernatural then. I mean, in principle, it could be a natural agent from another part of the universe. If he's not owning God, but he's saying intelligent design, that does open the door up to other agents in the cosmos who might have done it. Yeah,
it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's his argument.
So he's a weak materialist. Is that what your view?
Yeah. So he's a weak materialist because so there's strong materialism. Strong materialism is full out materialist atheism, that atoms and molecules, initial conditions of the Big Bang, laws of nature, no God. That's full blown materialism. Weak materialism, it affirms atoms and molecules, laws of nature, contingent. We're going to look at this word contingent, things making other things happen, things in the universe making other things happen. But then it also affirms belief in supernatural agency, where the laws of nature can be overpowered by something that's more powerful than nature. And this is something that it defies the laws of science. So yeah, I would call it a miracle, but they might not say that in the scientific, because it might not be acceptable in the scientific establishment to say that. But that's why he's a weak materialist. And I think that is only obvious. His weak material is only obvious from a Muslim perspective, because we don't traditionally, Muslim theologians haven't held that things in the universe actually make other things in the universe happen. And so when we analyze this concept of irreducible complexity from a Muslim perspective, then we can see the weak materialism. But when a materialist atheist criticizes this, he's upset because it's not materialistic enough. Right? So I think like this is it's a Muslim perspective.
Okay. So I mean, okay. So I'm just wondering what is wrong with being a weak materialist, do you think?
So I think there's two ways to look at the problem of being a weak materialist. There is the perspective of the strong materialist, the atheist. From the perspective of a strong materialist and atheist scientist, or an almost atheist scientist who behaves as though he's an atheist, methodological naturalist, there's a criticism and there's a problem. And I think that problem is not appreciated well enough by Muslims and also by Christians. So, and I want to look at that. And there's also a problem from a no materialist. I prefer that to an immaterialist. I'll tell you why, which is the perspective of a Muslim. And so what do you think if we start with the atheist?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So before I do this, I want to warn you. I want to warn everybody who's watching, because I'm going to take you a little bit out of your comfort zone. I'm going to try and make the atheist materialist argument as strongly as I can. And I really want everyone to understand this. And that means you need to kind of hold back on your instinct to respond. Because I think there is something that merits understanding. And this is going to be a problem that no materialism, the Islamic perspective, is going to solve. The Christian perspective, it can't solve it, but we can solve it.
Right.
So, there's a, from the perspective of strong materialism, there's a philosophical reason to have a problem with this kind of weak materialism, and then there's like an emotional reason that builds on this philosophical problem. So the philosophical reason is that so the standard scientific response to this, this is one of the reasons why intelligent design isn't considered science proper by the scientific establishment. It's that science is it's a project of discovering more and more things about the universe. So if we look at a particular phenomenon of biological complexity, then we might not be able to understand at this point what the natural causes are that led to this level of complexity. The approach of a scientist is to say that, okay, it's a problem that needs to be solved. Let's take things one step further. Let's try and understand how we could have arrived at this level of biological complexity through natural causation. So when an intelligent design advocate makes an argument that this was the result of the action of a supernatural designer, and he puts that there, then from the perspective of the scientist, it is preventing him from continuing his scientific investigation, because the progress of science has been plugged by something that is from his
a dogma, kind of a dogma that's saying, no, this is supernatural, don't go there, which of course is a red flag to a bull, isn't it? It's saying, we will go there, because the history of particularly the Christian West and the Christian church and science has often been one of these red lines. You can't cross these.
Exactly.
And so it creates this tension, this conflict, apparent conflict between science and religion.
Yeah, and that's the non-philosophical reasons. So the non-philosophical reason builds on the philosophical reason. And it says that, oh my God, there's a religious person who is saying God did it, and he's never going to let go of that because it's existential to him, and he has a history of faith irrationality, and this is really dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to go against all of our values of freedom and democracy and censor it to guarantee the whatever. So, but there is so what needs to happen is that I think that it's fair from the perspective of the materialist to say to the weak materialist, the one who's arguing for supernatural causation, that you should be open to scientific inquiry. Meaning that if you want to, they go much further than this, but I think that it's fair for them, for the materialists, to say that your conclusion of a supernatural designer needs to be a tentative hypothesis that needs to be open to further examination and critique and discussion. And I think that, to be fair to the proponents of intelligent design, Michael Behe, Stephen Meyer, I think they are open to that. And that's the evidence of that is in the back and forth, right? So the materialists, they'll give examples of how the flagellum could have evolved by a step-by-step process. And they'll say that there are many different kinds of flagella in different kinds of bacteria and non-bacteria. and that's evidence that it can evolve in different ways, and you can actually take small parts, and they give examples of how they can have some useful function, and then that's disputed by the intelligent design advocates, and it turns into very complex science,
technical,
very complicated science, and that actually, I think it goes to show that that Behe, Meyer, they're strong scientists, right? So they can actually make a scientific argument, and so I don't agree with this idea that they're not real scientists. But where is that idea coming from? That idea is coming from an apprehension that the door to further scientific inquiry is going to be closed.
I noticed on the if you look up Michael Behe, or you Google his name and look at the Wikipedia article, in the first paragraph, Wikipedia describes him as advocating pseudoscience. In other words, fake science. So this is something you would dispute. They're saying, and indeed he is a serious scientist at a reputable American research university. Has got quite a slur really on his work, arguably.
So I don't think that's fair. I think that's ad hominem argument. And so if somebody wants to disagree, and if the whole scientific community wants to disagree with it, like they should disagree with it. They should bring evidence for it. But it should remain like a civil and scientific academic discussion, right? And that's where it should be. But I think that there is a point that needs to be addressed, and so I feel that it would be better for the intelligent design advocate to point this out and say that, listen, I know that you are apprehensive. You're apprehensive because you think that I am going to close the door to further scientific inquiry. I see where you're coming from. You're thinking I'm an overzealous, irrational, religious person. I'm just trying to make a scientific argument. That's not what I'm trying to do, and it's not accurate for you to slur me in this way. So,
but there is a fear that it's undermining science. This ID argument, the Christian ID argument, and it's like saying that it's a god of the gaps, isn't it? Because science can't explain it, ergo supernatural agency, and that goes against the whole kind of scientific method, doesn't it? That one doesn't just suspend science because of religious dogma.
There's God of the gaps. There's also methodological naturalism. So God of the gaps, I have a perspective on it that I think we might not have time to talk about today. I do have a video in Thinking Muslim's Guide for Atheist Arguments on God of the gaps.
Right.
We can Google it. Maybe we can have another discussion.
Sure.
But I think methodological naturalism, I want to focus on that for a second. And I want to give the perspective of the scientific establishment. And so what's the idea here is that the scientist is searching for natural causes. The scientist is searching for natural causes. Now, from a Muslim perspective, a Muslim scientist is searching for associations that God has placed between things in the universe. And so if that's what I'm searching for, then there is some kind of methodological naturalism that I need to uphold. I mean, because what is methodology? So if you take materialism out of it, so materialism is the problem. And we're going to look at how to get rid of it. But if you take materialism out of it, and then you just understand what's left, then what's left is you are searching for how something in the universe is related to something else in the universe. And you're studying the atoms and molecules and regular associations. This is what you're studying. And so now somebody says that, well, there is something else. So from a Muslim perspective, like the miraculous agency of God. So I guess from a Muslim perspective, and that's the difference, right? That's the difference between the Muslim perspective and the weak materialist perspective of Behe. From a Muslim perspective, everything is already the action of God. I mean, there's no there's not going to be any competition. But because Behe sets up a competition between the explanation of natural phenomena, using other natural phenomena, between that and between God, there is a religion science conflict inherently built into it. Wow. There has to be. There has to be, and so, and I don't think that's well appreciated. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. I'm mindful that Behe is actually a Roman Catholic. I mean, he's quite open about this, and so there is a tradition, obviously, in Catholicism with Galileo and so on, where there has been some tension between science and the magisterium of the church, which denied, of course, at one point that the Earth went round the sun, and in fact, the Earth was the center of the universe. So, there is this history of conflict, but also, I mean, some eminent scientists have been Catholic as well. So
So I think what Muslims, we need to be conscious of this, because if we appreciate the standard scientific establishment critique of this and understand where it's coming from, and restrain ourselves from just having this because by imagining that by accepting this, we are removing God from science, removing God from religious belief, that's the mistake.
The Christian ID advocate would say that methodological naturalism is a bias that prevents them from ever reaching a rational conclusion.
So and I think that's a fair criticism. So the rational conclusion in the case of the intelligent design advocate is that there's design in nature. And that's a fair criticism, because methodological naturalism, while it has some valid concerns, it also has a blind spot, but that blind spot is a result of materialism. I'm going to show you that. And so when a materialist does methodological naturalism, because he already believes that the universe is atoms, molecules, laws of nature, initial conditions at the Big Bang, necessary entailment, no design, because he believes that, when he comes up with a scientific explanation, it's going to preclude design. It's going to, and so what the ID advocate is saying, that, well, that's not right. There's design. Clearly, the bacterial flagellum is designed, and he's right. Clearly, the bacterial flagellum is designed, and so over here, we agree with that. We agree with him, but the argument that he's making here is better made like this. I think it should be formalized like this. It should be formalized by saying, I don't have any slides for this, but just you can imagine this, that it says that if materialism is true, then there's no design. That's the major premise. If materialism is true, what do we mean by materialism? Strong materialism. If strong materialism is true, atoms and molecules, initial conditions of the Big Bang, laws of nature, blind forces of nature, then there cannot be any design in the universe. The universe would look very different. But this is my minor premise. There is design. Clearly, the bacterial flagellum is designed. So what does that mean? It means materialism is false. I think that's good. That's a good argument. It means that strong materialism is false, and there needs to be a designer. There needs to be an intelligent designer. But so what this does is it gets rid of the conflict, but it doesn't close all of the. It doesn't put everything into a coherent worldview, because the supernatural intelligent designer alone is not a solution.
So what's the solution then?
Okay, so in order to understand the solution, let's look at a Muslim critique. And so this is a an argument, a visual illustration of an argument called the argument from contingency. We spoke about it earlier in an earlier video on your channel. So the idea behind the argument from contingency is that things in the universe are dependent. So when I look at the sky, it's blue. I say, what made it blue? Everybody says, why is the sky blue? And by the mere fact that somebody asks, why is the sky blue? They are admitting that its blueness is dependent on something else. And so you search for an explanation. So the scientific search for explanations for natural phenomena, it is an admission, an implicit admission that those things are dependent. And we have a formal term for this. We call it contingent. Those things are contingent. And contingency means dependency. So what science attempts to do is explain dependent things, contingent things, using other contingent things. So why is the sun shining? Because of nuclear fusion. Well, nuclear fusion is also a contingent phenomenon. It's also dependent. It needs further explanation. And so you would go and you would describe it in terms of the atomic properties of hydrogen and helium and the loss of mass and E equals mc squared. And then that opens up another question. And so since science always explains things in the universe using other things in the universe, and since things in the universe are all dependent, contingent, it is really not giving an explanation. Why? Because dependent things cannot fulfill the dependency of something else. This is an intuition. It's like, and so I like to use this analogy of a illustrative analogy. It's not an analogical argument, but it's an illustrative analogy where you have a long line of leaning people. You have A leaning on B, and B leaning on C, and C leaning on D. If all you have is a long line of leaning people, then they're going to fall down. There needs to be something independent that is holding them up. And in its absence, everything would be lying on the ground. So there's what this illustration brings to light is that if A depends on B and B depends on C, then really B isn't doing anything. A is just depending on C. So if C was standing up straight, holding A and B, if C let go, they would both fall down. And what that shows is that it's doing all the work. So if you have something that's leaning on something that's leaning, then the second thing isn't really doing anything. It's just passing the buck to the next thing. And if they're all leaning, then there's nothing real for anything to depend on. So this intuition, it shows that it's impossible for contingent things to fulfill the dependencies of other contingent things. And so there is a necessary being. A necessary being is the opposite of a contingent thing. It's something that is independent. There's something independent that is fulfilling the dependencies of everything in the universe. So
can I, before we go, can I just use a different way of putting this to see if I've understood you correctly? Because this is obviously an analogy to an extent. People leaning on people on. Are you saying that therefore that the phenomena in the universe, which the blueness of the sky, can be explained by other causes to do with the sun, which in turn could be described by other causes? Are you saying that whole process, the existence of existence itself, is contingent and therefore requires a necessary being? So it's not so much that things are moving away from the leaning analogy, that all these contingent things need an explanation for their existence as such, which is not contingent, and ergo there must be a necessary being? Or what looks like you're doing here with the leaning people, it looks like a first cause argument as well. So the first cause is what brings these contingent series into being, gets the series going. But I don't think you're saying that. You're talking about ontology, aren't you? The very existence of matter itself, or the universe itself, requires, in all its contingency, in all its way you're describing it, requires a deeper metaphysical explanation just for its very existence. And that is the contingency and necessary being we're talking about. Have I got that? Is that more?
It's spoken like a theologian who's familiar with the arguments. So I've traditionally, the way that the contingency argument has been articulated by Ibn Sina and others in the Christian tradition as well, it's in terms of the kind of existence. So they'll say that you have contingent existence and necessary existence, and so it's possible for something to exist or not exist, and then you infer from that its ontological dependency on something that exists necessarily. I've chosen in my articulation not to do that. So this articulation also has precedent in Islamic tradition. It's this long line of leaning people analogy was used by the Mustafa Sabri, one of the greatest theologians of the modern age. And so I took it from him, and he's articulating other ways to formulate it. And so Mustafa Sabri was a critic of materialism, and he does a really good job. And so I've found that this analogy is a better way to communicate this idea to a materialist. And the reason is that this analogy doesn't look at the ontological contingent status of the existence of things, but it just looks at their features. And it says that their features, they need to be explained. So if I look at everything in the universe, when I look at the blueness of the sky, the shining of the sun, the blowing of the wind, the structure of DNA, the structure of a bacterial flagellum, when I look at all of these things, they need to be explained. And the reason why I think that this is superior is because I meet the scientist who's a materialist where he is. I'm starting from his point of departure. So because he's also searching for explanations of why the things in the universe are the way that they are. So this is an argument that looks at not the contingency of existence, although that's entailed by this, but the contingency of the features of the things in the universe that a scientist is also seeking to explain. So that's step one. Does that make sense so far?
Yep.
Okay. So so this is not a first cause argument. The first cause argument is an Aristotelian argument. So Thomas Aquinas, it's one of his 5 ways. But the Muslims traditionally have not made a first cause argument. A first cause argument, it's you take a line of dominoes and you push the first one, prime mover, right? And then that activates the second, activates the third, activates the fourth. So there's a series of activations. And what Mustafa Sabri did here is you're not pushing the dominoes, you're leaning them back.
Yeah.
Right. Which is different. And that's one of the reasons why, I actually call this the quranic contingency argument, because it's not the same as the contingency argument that was made by Thomas Aquinas, which had Aristotelian underpinnings. And you can see that by the conclusion, because the conclusion of this argument, conclusion of this argument is that no contingent thing fulfills the dependency of any contingent thing. So really, the sky isn't made blue by the diffraction of sunlight by the atmosphere of the earth. That's not what's making it blue. The thing that's making it blue is God, necessary being. So there's a jump from necessary being to God, but if you just say necessary, it's a necessary being that's making it blue. It's a necessary being that's making the sun shine. It's the necessary being that's making the wind blow. And the impulse of the materialist is to stand up and say, no way, like you're bringing God in everywhere, like you're getting rid of science. But you're not. What you're doing is you are reinterpreting natural causation as a series of regular associations that are dependent on God. And so these are regular ways in which the necessary being, let's just call it God for now, that the necessary being is upholding in the universe. And so so it's consistent. There's a rational argument for this. It's also consistent with our beliefs. So, when we get sick, the Prophet ﷺ, he taught us a dua. He taught us to take medicine, but then he taught us to say, Allahumma anta shafi la shifa'a illa shifa'uk. Oh Allah, you are the one who cures. There's no cure except your cure. And there's many, many examples of this. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no power nor might except by God. We have this concept of means. You take the means and then you rely on God. You take the sabab and then you rely on God. It comes out of this kind of perspective. So
can you just explain a bit more why it's impossible for contingent things to fulfill the dependencies of other contingent things? People may not be very clear what you mean by that. So you're saying that contingent things, like anything in the universe, can't be explained in terms of other contingent things. Ultimately, it must be explained in terms of a necessary being, i.e. God, ultimately. Can you explain that? Because although it's a perfectly rational thing to say, is that a necessary conclusion, or is that a conclusion of faith?
No, it's a necessary conclusion.
Okay, can you explain why it's necessary?
Okay, so there's many ways to do this, but what I've done is, the way that I choose to do it is through this analogy. It's not really an analogy; it's an intuition. And so I want to see if, let's see. So what's the intuition? The intuition is that let me use somebody else. One of my students, he said that he reformulated the long line of leaning people analogy, and he said that it's actually better if you, instead of having people leaning, you have them standing on each other's shoulders. So you have somebody standing on somebody else's shoulders, standing on somebody else's shoulders, standing on somebody else's shoulders, and there's no ground, or you put the ground there, right? So so without the ground, they'd all be falling. And
that ground, therefore, is not a first cause; it's an ontological necessary being. Is that right?
It's the thing that's sustaining everything. That's right.
Because there's a slight confusion there in my mind because it looks like you might be alluding to first cause there, like the thing that enables the first cause, the first series to get going. But you don't mean that. You mean a metaphysical. Right. So an implicit then in this, an unstated assumption is, I think you'd agree, that an infinite regress, an infinite series of contingencies going back into the past is not coherent or not possible. So therefore there has to be this ground, to use that analogy, to bring that about, this contingent series. That was an unstated assumption, because otherwise you can simply say, well, I don't need a ground. We can just have contingencies go on forever.
That's right. Yeah, I didn't present the formal argument. I just but yeah, that's right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So what this does is is that now the thing that is proving the existence of God, now God I've placed in bold, because what I mean by God here is not what is meant by God in the intelligent design argument for those who will put God there. So Behe won't do it, but others, they do. So what's meant by God there is a supernatural being, something that can overpower the laws of nature and is in competition with them. But here, God is a necessary being. It's a necessary being, and he has volition, he has agency. He designs everything in the universe. But the way that I know his existence is through the ontological dependency, contingency of everything in the universe. So so it's this thing that's proving the existence of God. And so now what it means is that I don't need to disprove any natural explanation, get rid of any natural explanation to make space for God, but rather this perspective of contingency, it eats up science. It swallows the whole thing.
Mm.
Sorry, this is from a Wise Long True course.
There's no competition. There's no competition then between science and this understanding by definition, because they're completely different paradigms, different ontologies. And they what one exists within the other. Actually, science exists within this larger paradigm. It gobbles it up. It swallows.
It gobbles it up. It gobbles it up. So, and this is this is something. And this is what traditional Muslims did. Muslims ate up Aristotle in the same way. Like there was never by changing it, by doing this. So if you just compare the three. So you have on the left hand side you have strong materialism.
Yeah.
In the middle you have weak materialism. On the right you have no materialism. So on strong materialism, contingent things make other contingent things happen, and there's no God. On weak materialism, contingent things make other contingent things happen, and there's also a supernatural being, a supernatural God, who can intervene and do something different. He can overpower. And so ID, it comes out of this worldview. It is speaking from this worldview, and that's why it's inconsistent with my beliefs as a Muslim, and also I think rational investigation.
Yeah, so it's no accident that Behe, for example, is a Roman Catholic, therefore, because he is coming from that Christian kind of mindset in that middle column.
Yeah. And then from an Islamic perspective, God is making everything happen. And he has established regular associations between the things in the universe. And so that this does not invalidate science, because I do the experiments, I make inferences to the best explanation, and I come to conclusions about how the universe works. I know that when I take medicine, I'm going to get cured. I know that there is a relationship between nuclear fusion and the shining of the sun. And so I can do everything, and I get my design too, because
and also it's impossible on that paradigm for science to disprove God. It's a category mistake.
Yes,
it's to be an error in thought, in thinking, in logic to think that science could disprove God. It's actually impossible, because it's a different level of discourse.
Yes, absolutely. So that's exactly right. So this is part of like what I actually teach this in a course called Why Islam is True. It's available online.
We'll put a link to that in the description. So how should Muslims use the concept of irreducible complexity then? Because surely it has some use, because it does actually showcase some stunning examples of complexity and design, I should say, and complexity in the universe. And that, I mean, the Quran calls our attention to ayat, signs in the universe. So, but does it have any utility for you?
Yeah, but first thing is that we actually don't need irreducible complexity to show design. So irreducible complexity, it says that you have design when something is so complex that evolution cannot produce it. So in order for you to see design on irreducible complexity, it has to reach that level. And the reason why that's the case is because there's an assumption of materialism. There's an assumption that things in the universe make other things happen. But if I take that away, then now I see design everywhere. So our meeting right now was designed. There's a purpose to it, right? You see purposes when I drink water. It's associated with the quenching of my thirst. It's all dependent on the necessary being. I know that I perceive purpose. I see purpose. So there is, and my relationship as a believer with God in my everyday life, it's based on the perception of purpose. And my gratitude to him is based on a perception of purpose. My worship is based on a perception of purpose. I have a purpose. My purpose is to worship God. So the standard of irreducible complexity is not required to show design. So the design inference William Dembski has a book called The Design Inference, and
Yes.
he uses this idea called specified complexity. And so it's all of these design inferences, you have to show complexity. So you don't need that level of complexity. And Muslims and Christians as well, I think, like, we've always seen design in the universe as an intuitive part of our religious experience. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when things reach a very, very high level of design, such as the examples that are brought to illustrate this phenomenon of irreducible complexity, then that amplifies design. It's even more designed.
Right.
So that's the usefulness of it. So the work that's done by the intelligent design scientific community is phenomenal. It's phenomenal because it is because they're believers in God and purpose. They are unveiling incontrovertible evidence of purpose, and it's really good, and I love it. I know you like it too. But then there's a third thing.
Oh, while we're praising intelligent design, then I recommend this book, of course, Stephen Mayer, Return of the God Hypothesis.
Yeah.
He says there are 3 science discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. There's some interesting, very high level scientific recommendations actually from this book, even from a Nobel Prize winner. So he's an opponent. He's a Christian. He's an opponent of IDs, but nevertheless, he makes some very interesting points, as you say.
Yeah, but then there's the third thing.
Yeah,
I think this is really powerful. It's that if there is a natural explanation for things that I previously thought were irreducibly complex, it doesn't undermine the perception of design. It actually strengthens it, because for God to not just, so there's this idea that in order for me to see design, God has to intervene and make this spectacular show, right? But if that spectacular show was a result of carefully designed series of causes and effects and initial conditions, and everything is dependent on God, it's far more spectacular. It's far more spectacular. So that's why I don't need to fight. I don't need to fight. I actually get a superior result if now I think that the rational perspective is to be open. Like, I'm open. The materialist isn't open to the fact that something doesn't have a natural explanation. I'm open to it. I can entertain an argument. I can look at it, but I'm not threatened. I'm not threatened by scientific explanations. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. So Muslims then don't need to place themselves into any conflict with science. They're simply not an issue by definition. Impossible.
Exactly.
So what's your position on evolution then, specifically with respect to Adam and Eve, our first parents, and how would that compare, for example, with Behe?
Okay, good. So I think broadly speaking, there's 2 issues with evolution from a theistic perspective. The first is whether or not it disproves the existence of God. And so what we've seen right now is that it doesn't, because contingency eats up everything. So if it were to be true, it wouldn't disprove the existence of God. But there's a scriptural consideration. And the scriptural consideration is that Revelation tells me that the first human being was created directly by God and is not the product of an evolutionary process. So I think, so how do we make sense of this? Now, there are the argument that I just showed, the Quranic argument from contingency, is the first of 4 arguments, which you can it'll be out inshallah in my book Kalam 3.0. It's also there in the Why Islam is True course. But these arguments, they stack on top of one another. First, you show that the universe depends on a necessary being. Then you show that being is an agent using design. Then you show that agent is one. And now everything in the universe is the action of one being on whom it depends. And then you show using miracles that, and also this concept of mass transmission, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam existed, and he performed miracles, And when you see that in the context of his claim to be God's messenger, God breaks a regular association, then that is divine confirmation of his claim. So what this does is, this is a very, very quick overview, but what this does is, and this is the reason why I'm explaining this, is that the Quranic revelation becomes something that is based on evidence. I actually have evidence that this is from the being on whom the universe depends. So now when I affirm my belief in the miraculous creation of Adam, I'm doing it based on evidence. So yeah, there's scientific evidence, but there's also revelatory evidence, and my revelatory evidence is not based on faith. So what a scientist, so a Muslim scientist would do is he would do everything that a scientist does, but then he has a data point that the scientist doesn't have. And when you put that data point in and you affirm and you get rid of materialism and you affirm the possibility of miracles, then the rational conclusion is that if scientific evidence led somebody to believe that evolution is true, then the rational conclusion would be to accept Adam from that as a miraculous exception. And it's not unscientific, because I believe that fire didn't burn Ibrahim alayhi salam, but I believe there's an association between fire and burning. So I can consistently affirm a general regular association and miraculous exceptions based on evidence. So now, where does this compared to Behe? What's the comparison? So I think that I'm a greater believer in design than someone like Michael Behe, because I don't require irreducible complexity to see design. I think that I'm a greater believer in natural explanations reinterpreted as regular associations than ID advocates, because I don't need to fight science. I just kind of eat it up. I think I'm a greater believer in miracles than ID advocates. That's why for me to accept Adam from evolution is really simple. But because they're weak materialists, they do affirm universal common ancestry relationship between chimpanzees and human beings, and that at the expense of their scriptural commitments to the Bible. And I think that if I just add in one comparison, I think that I'm more open-minded and Muslims should be, and they are more open-minded than the materialist, because the materialist often, I think he has many valid points, but this assumption of materialism is just wrong. I mean, it's just it's not it's false, rationally false, and I think it would be good for science to would give a refreshing perspective. It actually solves many other scientific problems as well.
Materialism is very much the worldview, the zeitgeist of the West, and it affects or infects everything. It's not just science; it's the way we see each other as human beings, or just random products of a meaningless universe, and the way there's so many phenomena which it affects art, music, philosophy. And it is a philosophy. It's not proven by anything. It's a posture, a view of the mind. But it's very much in tension, as you say, with the clear design of the universe, and it's in conflict with revelation and so on. So thank you very much indeed, Sheikh Hamza, for your very clear presentation of the strengths and weaknesses of Christian ID. So I like the fact that you're not just dismissing it. You're seeing the strengths in it. You've mentioned Stephen Meyer's work as well, and there's much that's of instruction and use for Muslims, but there is a Quranic version of design, the design argument, which you see as pretty impenetrable to any scientific objections. Indeed, it's impossible to refute it, because it's not, well, for the reasons you've explained. With that going, I'm not going to summarize it all again. So as we've said, the videos mentioned will be in the description below. The Quranic Case for God video series, the Thinking Muslim's Guide to Atheist Arguments, and there's a Discover the Prophet video as well. and this new book, which I'm very excited to hear about. When is that going to come out, do you think?
I think 2 or 3 months, inshallah.
2 or 3 months.
Yeah, you'll get a copy.
Thank you. Will it be a hard copy as well as being a PDF, or what?
Yeah, it's going to be a hard copy. Yeah,
hard copy. Excellent. Well, that'll be extremely interesting to have a look at. Inshallah, we'll have you on again to discuss that work. So, do you have any concluding words, Hamza, before we finish?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's very refreshing as a Muslim to see that when you think clearly, everything falls into place in a very nice way. And alhamdulillah for the blessing of Islam.
Alhamdulillah. Well, that's a beautiful summary there. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Sheikh Hamza. Until next time.